All right, we are recording. Hi, everybody. I am here with Julian. Julian has been on Paul VanderKlay a while back. Julian and I are kind of some of the original Paul VanderKlay fans. And so, Julian, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you wanted to talk about today.
Yeah, I'm never too good at these. So I'm Julian. You guys will know me from the Randos and Paul and all of that. I've been active in that space. I'm a Canadian Hutterite. I work as a welder, and we also make hand sanitizer. So if any of you guys are, wanting to get your hands clean, you know where to go. And so I've been reading this book by the former Pope Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger, Introduction to Christianity. Started reading it and just had a really hard time with sort of where he was going with his discussion. So I reached out to Mary, and she was willing to have a conversation about what he's getting at. So hopefully we'll be able to untangle some of the concepts in the first chapter in this conversation. So I guess that's
okay. Great. Well, we were discussing one of the main themes that he has early in the book, which has to do with what he calls the fall of logos, right? So that has to do with what it is that as human beings in general, we think we can know about, what kind of knowledge we think we can have, what is our access to truth. And he makes a distinction between the kind of truth we have when we have understanding, the kind of access to being, right?
Mm-hmm.
Versus what he calls techne and what it is called techne. So what did you kind of get? What kind of handle did you get on that? So
yeah, I guess, and I suppose the sort of, coming from the whole context in the Paul VanderKlay conversation, I immediately sort of connect that to, people like Peugeot and Vervaeke and Ian McGilchrist and all of these figures who sort of have this distinction between, Kierkegaard would talk about subjective and objective knowledge. In McGilchrist, the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere. Peter's going to talk about world as a form for action, world as a place of objects. And I guess what I'm now, to sort of think in that vein, I wonder if that's a helpful way of thinking about the distinction he's making. And then as I ask that question, I suppose the question for me is, what exactly is the kind of knowledge he's talking about when he's getting at, this understanding type of knowing? What exactly is the truth we're coming in contact in? And I have this quote, just a little quote from early on, if I can find it here. That sort of says wow, no, I can't find it. He says we've limited ourselves. Oh no, I lost it. Yeah, what do you make of that? You sort of get the question I'm asking.
Okay, yeah, I kind of get the question, and I think it's like a really apt question and gets into all the themes that like Paul VanderKlay talks with people about, because I think it's really become a very internal kind of question for people in our time. So let me kind of review what Ratzinger says about it from a historical standpoint. Is he says that the ancients thought that the proper subject of the contemplation of a human being, or the highest object of contemplation, would be being itself. They believed they could have access to being, to knowing the thing in itself through their contemplation of it. And So they had a kind of confidence in the human ability to know things. Now, they looked at the world as being structured in a way that there were things that were more real and things that were less real. So the most real things were the highest things in their estimation. And then there was knowledge all through the whole chain of being. When you got down to the human world and to the things that human beings made, and Ratzinger makes the point that the idea of techne is not merely an idea of a thing that you make, but it has to do with a kind of knowledge that you have. So when you get down into that kind of knowledge, the knowledge of human things, because human things participate so imperfectly in being and are things that quickly pass away, right? That they are, and they're very temporary. They're always made imperfectly, even though they may be striving after being. Well, let's use an example. An example might be, let's say someone makes a carving of a cat. And that would be a techne, that would be an art, because the Greeks did not really distinguish between art. Like we have a distinction between technology and art, but they really didn't. Let's say someone made a carving of a cat, but the knowledge of that object that was made is only a very dim, imperfect knowledge, other than as opposed to your knowledge that you could have of catness through your experience with real cats, right?
Okay.
So
Okay.
that would be a very imperfect kind of knowledge. But in our modern time, what we've done is we have decided that the knowledge of the things that we make is the highest knowledge. It's the only firm knowledge we have, and we really can't know these other things. We've lost any confidence in our ability to know things in their own being. Does that make sense?
This is where, like, I just want to ask about, 5 questions.
Okay.
Okay, so going back all the way to the beginning, you were talking about this sort of confidence that we can know being. Like, first of all, this is such a slippery word. Like, what do you mean by being? Because you have some theologians who talk about, God as sort of being beyond being, or even being itself, or being participates in God. And so I guess by being, do you sort of mean, all of, gosh, this is slippery, sort of God and the world simultaneously? Or do you mean just the world?
I would
or
say,
do you mean God?
Okay, the first thing that I would say is that our knowledge is of the world, but knowledge of the world is knowledge of God, because God made the world. So that when we see the world, we can see through the world. Let's put it in a real simple way. We say we can see through the world to the mind of God.
Okay.
That would be the way that the ancients thought, that when you see things, you're seeing through them to their source, to the logos that made them, and that their being. Let's use the cat as an example. The being of the cat participates in some way in the being of God, because of it being in some way an expression of that logos. And that our knowledge of it is participation in the thought of God, because our own reason participates in the thought of God. And our own knowledge of things participates in God's knowledge, which is his creative thought about creative thinking things. He thinks things, he creates things by thinking them, they come into being, and they participate, however imperfectly. There's, in the ancient cosmology, there's like a chain of being. So you have God at the top, being itself at the top, and then you come down, and as you come down the levels, things are participating more and more imperfectly in being, but they're still participating in being until you get to the things that human beings make, and they're like the most imperfect. And what Ratzinger is saying is that modern man thinks of the things that he makes as the things he knows the most, as having the most being, and thinks of these other things in the natural world and up into, spiritual realities, thinks of them as the vague, imperfect things that you can't know, but has a great deal of confidence in his ability to know the things that he makes.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good summary. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what you sort of really well summarized what Ratzinger was saying about how God speaks, and he speaks things into being, and sort of we sort of through his logos, and so through Jesus, he said it so much better than I will. sort of we're able to sort of get into this thought of God, this word of God, this logos of God, and come back into contact with God. So sort of this connection between his speech and the world he creates is sort of something we can come into contact with, and we have real knowledge of being, I suppose. That's a really bad way of putting it, but
no, that's good. Yeah, it's a question of being able to say, yes, we really know things, and we really know God through these things. All right.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that we know that we comprehend God fully, because you take a thing like a cat. A cat, there's a certain mysteriousness to all being, right?
Yeah.
There's a mysteriousness to that cat, right? That we can't fully, you can keep on learning about cats for forever, right? And especially is that mysterious that, when John Vervaeke talks about the more, that every time, whatever we go to look at in the world, there's always more. There's a moreness. It has he calls it the suchness, the thing that it is, but then there's also the moreness of the thing that is being disclosed all the time. So things open up to us, and there's a mysterious depth to everything. But the fact that there's a mysterious depth that we cannot fully comprehend, and fully, as we like to say, in that very evocative phrase, we can't fully wrap our mind around it, right? We can't fully grasp it. And yet, that doesn't mean that we don't know it. I mean, you would not say, that like another human being who's in your life, like say a sibling or a parent, or, a close friend, or somebody that you're very close to, you wouldn't say, just because they've lost all mystery and ability to surprise you, that you don't know them at all. Your knowledge can always become deeper, and yet there's a real knowing there. All right. And so that's how all of reality appeared to the ancients. That's how it all was living. It all was mysterious, but yet we had real contact with it, with our minds. We had real contact with it, with our minds, through contemplation, based on also our actual participation with it, right? And gets into that whole idea of participation, with Barfield and all that. We're so embedded in the world, and we participate in being ourselves. So we're part of this whole thing that we come to know. And modern man rejects that as any kind of real knowledge, and wants to limit himself. And like Ratzinger makes the point that on several instances where we narrow our vision, that is as though by saying, oh, well, I can't really know those things, that we're being humble, right? Somehow but it's like a false humility, because you're you're denying that operation of the logos.
Yeah, that's really helpful. That interesting how the way you were talking about participation as, all of reality sort of participating in the thought or in the logos of God. The way I've tended to think of participation is in terms of existence, where all things sort of, God sort of sustains all of reality in being, and so all things have their existence in God, and so there's the sense of depth that reality has is sort of, it sort of comes from the fact that the radical Orthodox theologians have a way of talking about this, where they say the the sort of material world is sort of nothing in itself, but it's only something through its participation in God. And so there's this sense of, and then they connect this to the modern nihilism, where this sort of intense focus on the purely material ends up leading to nihilism, because you're sort of how would you put it? You're sort of just dealing with nothing in the end. The sand just falls through your fingers. And so it's this participation in God, the fact that he sustains everything in being, that everything has its existence in him, that gives things their depth and their and so on. And so they talk about a Christian materialism, where it's only through this sense of participation and that everything has its existence in God that he can actually truly value matter for what it is.
Yes, and I think there's a thing about this that becomes very internal. Now, Paul VanderKlay talks about, he says that because he is a modern man, that he is also a materialist, and that he has to constantly fight his own materialism, right? And his own secularity, because this is how he grew up, and this is the world that he's been in, and his education and everything, in spite of the fact of being, in a Christian milieu all of his life.
Yeah.
So the way that he corrects for that is, he says he reads C.S. Lewis's Miracles at least once a year, right? Sort of like religiously, because what it does is it corrects for that, right? Okay, so I see this as kind of this generational problem. So Paul VanderKlay is about 10 years younger than I am, but I also grew up in a very materialistic world, very similar to him, maybe not quite as strongly, and subsequent generations have grown up with the materialism even more entrenched, or strongly imbibing the materialism even more strongly. I think that a lot of that has to do, and this gets back to Ratzinger talking about the power of this the kind of seductive power that this techne has, right? If we look at it in terms of our technology, because the fact of the matter is that the technology works, right?
Yeah.
We cannot deny that the technology works, and that it is incredibly powerful, right? And that our world becomes more and more technological, and the technology which we have today would seem like magic to ancient peoples, right? If I say that I could talk to you and you're in thousands of miles away from me, or that I could travel across the continent in just a few hours, that all would seem so magical. Or that that I could go into a hospital and they would put me in a machine and they would use something that I can't see, some sort of waves of either light or radiation or something, and actually be able to see inside of my body and see the structure of my bones and my organs and all of that.
Yeah.
All that stuff seems so magical. So we can't deny that the technology works, right? And that gets to this idea of this this practical knowledge where people tend to say, now put the practical knowledge on the top, right? And the fact that it works and that it gives us the ability to manipulate so many things in the world makes it extremely powerful and thereby extremely seductive. So that things that we cannot manipulate. Oops, I lost you there, Julian.
Oh, I'm back. Somehow lost connect.
All right.
Yeah.
So we didn't stop recording. So so anyway, what I was saying was the power of the technology and the ability to allow us to manipulate the world is extremely seductive in making us feel like it's the most important thing because of the power that it gives us. Right. But here's the problem. And this is where we get into this whole, Paul VanderKlay's talked a lot about the, Pascal's idea about the spirit of geometry versus the spirit of finesse, right? That there's things you can grasp and you can manipulate, and then there's things that you can't. And really, we can manipulate things, but if we try to manipulate persons, we're in trouble, right?
Yep.
Okay, so right now what's happened is our technology has become a tool for one person to manipulate another.
Yeah.
So part of the reason why the technology is both on the one hand feared, but on the other hand seems so enticing is the same reason that there's always been this demonic idea of using magic or spirits or something to manipulate other human beings. Now it can be done through the technology. So it's that same old temptation, the temptation to deal with a person, whether that person is another human being or whether that person is a spirit or is even the spirit of God, as though it were something we can wield, something we can manipulate, right? And I see that as like it's gone into the souls of the younger generation because they see themselves as both persons who can use the technology to manipulate others, but who are also manipulatable by others. And their concept of a human being as what in full a human being is, a person is, not something to be manipulated, is being eroded. It's being eroded away. They have to recapture that. They have to recapture that reality of being a person. And that's one of the reasons I think that I'm a little more resistant to it, and the previous generations was because of our contact with the natural world. And I think that's something that I keep trying to insert into the conversation, that we've got to have this contact with the natural world, because that's what gets us back into that participatory knowledge of being.
Ah, gosh, you have said so many things I want to respond to, but oh boy, where do you begin? I mean, that whole connection between technology and alienation from reality is, that's a super profound one, where you create this sort of false buffered reality that closes you off from everything that's sort of essential to being human, that puts you in touch with the eternal. Just think of the types of things that that sort of get, I often think of the sort of mainstream, television discourse that happens where I always have such a hard time describing it. There's just such a purely immanent focus there. They'll talk about politics, they'll talk about what this celebrity did, and it always strikes me that there's just not a single there's nothing eternal about the conversation. There's no discussion about theology or philosophy or tradition, or it just strikes me that so much of what happens on so much of the discourse that happens in sort of the mainstream society is just so alienated from this getting in touch with what's eternal, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I had to.
And
go ahead.
It often strikes me that the types of things I'm interested in, the types of conversations I want to have, are just so out of mainstream. They're just, I want to. It just, when you listen to, when you can sort of get caught up in your own bubble and think about these ideas, and then when you listen to the types of things that people will talk about on a sort of political television channel or something, it's just such a universe apart. It's like you start to wonder if the types of things you're interested in have any connection to reality, in a sense, because you're sort of focused on the eternal, and they're so focused on groveling around with their noses in the dirt. In fact, they're not. They're sort of groveling around in this alienated, abstract world that has nothing to do with reality. It's sort of as if they've created this castle in the sky, and now they're talking. They're sort of having this discourse within this castle in the sky that has no roots in reality or earth or the eternal, and acting as if they're in touch with reality. If you get what I'm saying, it's a really hard time.
My husband and I were watching something. I mean, it might have been several years ago. We saw this show, and it was like it might have been a documentary type of thing, but it was about an incident that really happened where a man was with a couple of friends, and they were somewhere up north where the terrain was quite rugged, and they were doing some kind of, I guess, rock climbing or mountain climbing or something, and there was some kind of accident. And this man had fallen down into some sort of place where his friends could not locate him, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess they had searched for him for a while, and then they had given up, and then they had gone back to their camp at like the base of this mountain. And meanwhile, this man, who I think his leg was broken, goes on this personal journey that took, I think it was a number of days that it took him to climb up out of this place where he had fallen and drag himself, laboriously over this rugged terrain and up the side of this mountain and stuff to get to the camp where his friends were. And at the time that he finally connected with his friends, they were just about to leave. Right. And I'm thinking that it was kind of like him recounting like what he did, how he survived. He ate these lichens off the rock and things like that. And he talking about his thoughts and his determination to survive and everything as he's going through this horrendous ordeal. And as he talks about this whole thing, the whole time, you keep waiting for him to say something like, and at this point I was so desperate that I prayed, or, I asked for help, or some spiritual something that gave a hint that he's more than just an animal that is trying to survive, right? And there was nothing in all of that whole thing. And we just looked at each other like, how can this be? This is like you're not even really listening to a real human being talking about a real human experience. Everything is made based on the mechanics of what he had to do and the will, the determination, but nothing external to him and his will and the environment. That's all there was, and that was all that he spoke about. And it was like, somehow or another, this doesn't seem like it would be the real way that a real human being, the kinds of, there had to be moments of something more reflective, something more about the larger place in the universe that this kind of situation would evoke in a man.
Yeah, I mean, the questions of trust and a sense of hopelessness and faith, and just sort of general existential themes. Yeah. But I guess that's sort of one. I'm sort of thinking of the sort of brightly lit supermarket scene, or the sort of brightly lit camera. The studio and the hosts are standing there, and they interview this person. They ask these just inconsequential questions in this 5-minute segment, and it just, the banality of it. I don't know, but we should. I really want to get back to the book.
Okay.
So here's another question on. So this is something I was really wondering as I was reading, Ratzinger, is, so what exactly you're talking about? This catness. We're sort of in contact with reality, and we come into contact with this cat, and we have this sense of the essence of a cat or something. And I'm trying to understand what kind of truth is that. So one way of thinking about it is, putting on my Kierkegaardian lenses, he would distinguish between a sort of objective look at the cat, and maybe that's sort of the scientific perspective. Here are the atoms, here's the eyes, here's the tail. If we cut it open, here's what we'll see. And then there's the sort of how, what he would call the subjective how, where you come into a relationship with this cat, and there's just this different dynamic of being in contact with a physical existing being, and even a living thing, and there's a relationship. There's a relational type of knowing. I think Peugeot has a word for it. No, not Peugeot, but Vervaeke has a word for this. Maybe participatory knowing. No. Yeah, one of his P's. And so I'm sort of wondering what kind of type of knowing does Ratzinger think has been displaced as we move outside of the medieval picture and come into the scientific age, where, I mean, he says that at one point, we leave the quest for understanding being to one side, and we completely focus on the human and our sort of the human world. And that just confuses me because isn't the scientific method sort of all about understanding reality? Isn't that all about understanding what is a cat made of and so on?
Well, like, E.F. Shoemaker said that if you take a cat and you dissect it, and you can know all about its anatomy and its physiology, how all of its muscles and bones work together, and you could then dissect it down, and you could talk about its cells or its tissues, and then its cells, and then its biochemistry, and all that. And when you get all finished doing that analysis, and now it's what Pirsig would call the analytical knife. right? Per sig in the art of motorcycle maintenance. When you've finished using that analytical knife on the cat, Shoemaker said, you will then know everything about the cat except what makes it a cat.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So it's not that science doesn't, it's not that we don't learn things using the scientific method, but we are learning about things. But we're not learning about the being of things. That's not.
So how would you distinguish that? I mean, so let me frame that in a different way. I mean, often, okay, there's this guy on Paul's channel called Carl. You know Carl, right?
Oh yeah.
The guy in the comment section, and he is always talking about God number 1 and God number 2, and how the fundamental problem in our age is we've forgotten about natural law, and that doesn't strike me as really helpful in this conversation, because if you look at sort of early modern figures like Grotius or Locke, they did have some kind of a conception of natural law, and probably exactly the kind of conception that someone like Carl is thinking about. And so Carl would have a way of saying that there is sort of an order to things. There is sort of this natural law, or there are these science would talk about the laws of nature. I don't think that's what we're trying to get at when we talk about the being of a thing, right? We're not talking about how cats, if we follow the sort of scientific law, how cats are always going to act. I don't think that's what we're trying to get at. Does that make sense?
Well, I don't know that I don't know how the natural law fits into what we're saying about this particular thing. I'd like to kind of set that.
Yeah, let's bracket it.
I'd like to set that part aside and just, I think for the purposes of, the Ratzinger book, is the point is that the point he is making is that we used to look up and we used to believe that we could contemplate being, and that we've lost confidence in our ability to know anything other than what we learn with that, as Persig would say, with that analytical knife.
Okay.
So what is it that we know? Well, Persig then would say we have a qualitative experience. We know the quality of the encounter that we have with the things that we experience in the world. And we know when we are encountering something of quality. This is very similar. I had a conversation with Savella King on our channel. We talked about this idea of quality, and I talked about a Catholic thinker named Dietrich von Hildebrand, who talks about our encounters with beauty and the fact that when we encounter these things, this is similar too to what C.S. Lewis talks about when he talks about men without chests. Like, he talks about the people who go to visit the waterfall, right? And the one person who says it's pretty and the other who calls it sublime. There's a perception of quality in the person who says that it is sublime, that it differs from the person who sees it as merely pretty.
Yeah.
But there's that one is seeing through it. Dwight Longenecker, in his book, I think it's called The Romance of Religion, he says that the atheist will talk about religion and they'll say, oh, I see through all that. And he said, seeing through is exactly what they don't do. The atheist is like a man who looks at a window and sees only the glass because he's actually not seeing through.
Yeah, yeah.
It's this whole idea of that what we encounter, we see through. Everything that we are encountering in the world, we see through it to the so that it is disclosing something or opening something up to us as we encounter it because we're seeing through it. And
okay, can I jump in? See, like I completely get fundamentally I completely get what you're saying. It just sort of sounds like
experientially, right?
Again?
How do you get it? You get it experientially because you've had the experience, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was having a conversation yesterday with a friend of mine, and he the weirdest conversation because okay, this is gonna be different. So we're listening to a song, and I was telling him, you know, the guy who it was a guy playing a guitar, and a lady next to him was sort of doing this humming thing along, and then I told him, you know, these two people, the guy said he went on the stage, and then he just sort of started playing, and the woman sang along, and they'd had no practice before. So the whole thing was sort of, I was describing it, he was starting to play, and then she sort of came on the same wavelength, and then suddenly they're able to make music in the way that Vicky talks about this, you know, the conversation coming together, and then this third thing arises. And I was describing this to him, and I said, you know, I've never had this experience, you know, with music, but I've had this in a conversation where I'm talking with someone, and he or she pushes me in a new direction, and suddenly I find myself embarked on a new journey with this person that brings us to a different place. And so I'm describing this to him, and then he says, you know, music is really all about having this little chemical released in your brain that makes you feel this. And I'm like, oh, yeah. And so that's exactly what you're sort of saying is you're sort of stepping outside of the experience and pretending to sort of survey it objectively, but in the sort of analytical knife, you're doing violence to the experience. And so I guess the question I have,
he'd be a lot of fun on a date, wouldn't he?
yeah, I don't really feel anything. This is just chemicals in my brain. And okay, so what you're sort of describing is a sort of phenomenological approach or something like that. But I don't think the medievals were doing sort of primitive phenomenology. They were doing something else. So what does it mean from the medieval perspective to say we're looking into we're sort of apprehending the being of a thing, we're looking at the thing in itself, and we have a confidence that, I mean, what kind of truth are they getting at that isn't this sort of phenomenological, experiential, Kierkegaardian, how subjective way of knowing?
Well, I guess it would depend on which medievals you're talking about, because.
And this is where, sorry, I just want to jump in. This is where what I was trying to say with natural law, because what often people talk about with the medievals is, you know, they had this conception of the universe that, you know, there was this order to the order of things, and you had to find your place in it, and so there was something like this natural law, and so people would say, you know, when you're contemplating the being of things, what they were getting at is sort of this natural law thing. But yeah, I don't quite. I suppose I don't see how the notion of natural law completely fades in the modern perspective either.
Well, when it comes to the medievals, I think it depends on which medievals you're talking about, because you have two strains of thought that go through the medieval world. You have the Platonic and you have the Aristotelian, and there is some tension between them, right? So the Platonic idea is that there are these, there are these forms, there are these eternal, like eternal patterns of being that, and the Platonists are different on this in terms of how they believe these things kind of come down. I think Plato kind of thought that we are, we are remembering that our souls were in the world of forms and then drop into our incarnate, our life, but that we have a memory, then in a sense, all learning is remembering in our participation in that in those universal forms of what things are, that we had before, before our souls ended up in our bodies, kind of thing. So it's kind of like there's a poem by Wordsworth about, it kind of has a kind of like a little Hallmark picture of, in a sense, of a baby coming down from, the soul of a baby coming down from heaven, trailing the stars in its wake as it falls down into earth, and all of its being is, or all of its learning is remembering, as it grows. And that's kind of one of the strains of Platonic thought, that the reason we recognize these things is because we're remembering them from our previous existence. Now, Aristotle, of course, said, that's not the way it works. He says that we abstract them. So like you take the little child, and the little child, let's use the example of the cat again. So the little child sees a cat, and the mom says, "Oh, that's a cat, that's a kitty cat." And then they see a second cat, and the mom says, "Oh, cat." And then they see a cat in a book, a picture, and somebody says, "Oh, cat." And then they see another cat out in the street that they've never seen before, and they go, "Cat," because they have extracted or abstracted catness from these experiences of cat, and now they identify the cat, so that they have created in their mind this abstraction of what the reality is of cats, so that now they can apply that identity to all the different cats that they see, right? So that's how Aristotle believed that we come to know. Thomas Aquinas is, would follow along those same lines, that nothing is in the intellect that is not first in the senses. I think that modern, or I should say recent, and so I'm trying to talk about a time, but not like an age, not like an eon or something like that, of thought, that recent cognitive science would say that we have that we're born already with many cognitive structures already in our brain. So it tends to be almost like a merging of the Platonic idea and the Aristotelian. Now that we already have a lot of structure built into us that permits us to know the world and to make these abstractions. All right. So the medievalists, though, that's kind of what they would say, and they didn't have access to the cognitive science that we have today, and the stuff that like you learn if you go through John Vervaeke's Meaning Crisis lectures and stuff. But that we have a priori structures, is that's something that's been thought about for some time. That we have we have to have a priori structures, otherwise we can never make any sense of them.
Okay. Yeah. So where are we at now?
We're
So
talking about the medievals.
okay. So where was I here? So here describes like the shift that happens against the scholastic equation. Being is truth. He advances his own formula. I'm going to butcher these Latin words. Verum quia factum. That is to say, all we can truly know. That is to say, all that we can truly know is what we have made ourselves. So that's a shift he sees happening, and yeah, having a hard time wrapping my head around that shift. Because yeah,
Well,
so
you
being
haven't lived through that shift. So the question you would ask, or the question that might be helpful to you to ask, is where am I? You know, where am I? Because you lived past that shift. You didn't live through it. So have you inherited it?
yeah, I mean, I'm sure. I mean, I'm a product of a secular age, so I would have that sort of built into me in some sense. So you sort of have to deconstruct those sort of scientific modes of thought in you in order to, get in touch with. Yeah, I mean, I do. I just have a hard time understanding why he's equating something like science with our own making. That's what I have a hard time getting at, because I mean, the whole mythology around science is that it isn't our own making. We're getting in touch with reality. We're
well, wait a minute. Okay, so the method is of our making. Okay.
Yeah.
The method itself is of our making. And I wouldn't say we're not getting in touch with real things through the scientific method. The question,
Yeah, I agree.
The question is, how much, it's a slice, right? Because in science, in the scientific method, we're dealing with what we can quantify, right? And with what we can experiment on, what we can quantify.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
We can measure things that we can measure. So we have to eliminate, how Paul is always doing that thing where he puts his hand over one eye and says, when you're doing the science, it's like you have to look only through one eye. Right?
Okay. Yep. This is the sort of your encounter with a cat, or your encounter with music, to take the example of my friend, and everything that's going on in that encounter, and everything that, all of the truth that is disclosed in that encounter, and then the sort of scientific reduction happens when you try to sort of say that all that's going on in that encounter is that which I can sort of capture by my method. So
right,
yeah, that's
right. That's it. Right.
Yeah, and that actually explains something Ratzinger was saying about. Gosh, I wish I had these places. I wish I had these sentences. These. Wish I had them written down somewhere. But he says something about how science sort of reduces that which sort of fits in the system, or that which can be experimented upon. Do you remember that line? It's a really good line, if I could find it.
Where he talks about that we can hold in our measuring grasp. Is that the line?
He said something a bit different. Goodness, I can't find it now. He says something about how what is true becomes reducible to what fits within the method, or the method itself becomes a measure of truth, which that's very illuminating.
Well, and that's and it's the difference too between fact, right? Fact and truth. It's the difference between fact and truth. So we're very concerned with facts. You know, people are always talking about scientific facts. You know, here's a scientific fact, and it's like the scientific facts now go at the top of the hierarchy. Those are the greatest things that we get. Scientific facts, you know. Whereas, okay, so if you have two people who are married, and you were to say, tell me all the scientific facts about your husband or your wife, right? You know, a big fat lot of good that's going to do you in terms of having a relationship with that person, right? And the same thing's true then of the whole world of, and all the being, right? And all the beings in the world. The scientific facts that we have about all of the structures of the world do not help us in terms of our relationship with it, or even of ourselves. You know, the scientific facts that you can learn about yourself are not of real great help for you, for your relationship with yourself, even. Right? You can't be reduced to scientific facts. And that's where the ancients or the medievals, you know, we tend to want to dismiss the knowledge of people even just 100 years ago, because they didn't have the scientific facts that we have, and we're very we're very proud of our scientific facts. You know, I mean, we can publish whole books of our scientific facts, and we're very proud of them. And then because these other people didn't have our scientific facts, or may have said things that sound to us like scientific facts, or may have been attempted scientific facts, like, you know, how the orbits of the planets go, or something like that. Oh, well, look, they didn't. What did they know? They didn't know the scientific facts. Like, we know the scientific facts. Aren't we so wise? Then when we come to that conclusion, we tend to want to dismiss everything that they had to say. Right? Everything they had to say about being, everything they had to say about relationships, everything they had to say about God, about worship, about all, because wait a minute, how am I going to listen to you? You don't have the scientific facts I have. And that's how we get so, how we end up so so tiny in our knowledge. You know, like some people say, we know more and more about less and less.
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of connected to what I was saying earlier about the sort of materialist nihilism, where this sort of focus on the purely material ends up sort of turning to sand in your hands, because this connection to the eternal has been ruptured. And where was I going to go with this? Yeah, I mean, and I've often also noticed how this whole discourse of facts and scientifically proven can sort of turn into a kind of mythology of its own, where the sort of the rhetorical moves you see. I'm often almost immediately suspicious when I hear someone talking about scientifically proven, or, you know, this is based on facts, or this is you know, proven by logic and evidence. That type of rhetoric, it's just sort of a very powerful rhetorical move to make in our, you know, technological scientific age. And yeah, it doesn't, I mean, it just has that kind of, it sort of ends up being a sort of discourse of power, doesn't it? Because, you know, if you sort of think of, you know, someone like Foucault, the way this sort of rhetoric of, you know, facts and logic and science and so on ends up sort of justifying, it sort of ends up being a power move, where because I have the science on my side or the facts on my side, I can, I'm justified in sort of bringing this kind of agenda, imposing this kind of agenda on the population or on this group of people and so on. And you can see all kinds of examples of this.
Right. So what like for you personally, you see all of this, you realize that, like Paul says about reading miracles every year, that you have to do something actively, like this is what you grew up in, right? And you realize its power and its ability to dominate you, to control you, your ability to use it to control and manipulate others, all of these things, right? All of these kind of demonic aspects of it. And yet at the same time, I mean, you're not going to give up using computers and driving cars and, all of that.
I'm super tempted.
What?
I'm super tempted by that.
Okay, but what would be, like, for yourself, what's the way to exercise in yourself the other kinds of knowing and the contact with being and that sort of thing? Because it seems to me that that's where a lot of these questions, when Paul has dialogues with people, that they come down to is, okay, what do I do? I see where we're all at. I see where I'm at. Now what do I do about it?
And it strikes me that as inadvertently you've ended up sort of asking the question of the meaning crisis. You're basically asking what do you do to give your life meaning? What do you do to come in contact with, with transcendence, with eternity, with the sacred, with God? And I think the most reliable way I sort of break out of that frame is honestly, I wouldn't say that the materialist frame is something that is very, maybe this is hubristic of me, but I don't think I'm particularly captured by it. I think I've sort of read enough that I'm sort of, at least intellectually, I'm very much in a different space. But I think sort of existentially speaking, the way I sort of break out of that frame in practical terms, the most is through conversations, just having a conversation with someone, and just this sense of being lifted up to a higher plane, or just this, in the moment of vulnerability, you expose something of yourself, and there's this filling of the other, and there's just something, the community that develops there, the love that happens there, there's something coming from a background of from a people who value community. There, to me, there's something, and I hope the Roman Catholic in you isn't offended by this, but there's something sacramental that happens in a conversation.
Right. Yeah. Definitely.
And I suppose another way would be, prayer is another way of breaking out. Just spending time in silence, spending time in prayer is another way of just breaking out of that fast and technological and hyper fast mode of existence. I wonder if, distinguishing between what we sort of know in our heads and what we act out existentially, I wonder if for many of the people my age, they would really recognize that there's something off about the technological, social media, hyper fast information age, that there's just something off, there's something missing, there's something, there's a lack of something, there's a lack of transcendence and so on. But there's an inability to sort of come into contact, find ways, practices of coming into, just getting something meaningful in their lives. There's a lack of contact with nature, a lack of contact with other people. There's a lack of contact with God and so on. So I would maybe distinguish between the sense that something is off and then the actual practices that put you into contact with something different.
Well, that's one of the things that, I would say when I look at, like, my grandchildren and the kind of world that they're in, and how technological it is, how much they imbibe these things from the time that they're small. And I always want to try to give them that contact with the natural world as much as possible. And but I see the draw that it has in the way that it sucks people in. So I think it's going to be a real struggle for that generation. It's a real struggle for your generation. I think when you say that you're looking back at the medievals and you're thinking about how they lived and how they viewed the world and the kind of reading you're doing, I think all of these things are really great. I just, one of the things that I see is as a connection to the natural world that we have. I talked about in one of my videos about, when you raise animals on a piece of land, a piece of property, even if it's a small piece of property, because I only have an acre yard, right? And then you take those animals and you spread their manure on the yard, like the chickens compost their manure and then use that to fertilize the plants and use that to fertilize vegetables. And then you eat the vegetables, right? So that you have this loop of communication that goes on through your body and the animals and the plants, so that some of the things that I grow, I also feed to them. And you're forming a loop of communication. And when people don't eat natural food, real food, that really comes from land, where animals are involved, in animal manures are involved with the production of the food, and that all of that biological life that's, the microbial life that's in us and is in the soil that communicates. And there's such a push now to feed people artificial food like lab-grown meat and garbage like that, that has no contact with the earth and is taking us out of that entire circuit of communication that goes on. I see that as an extremely dangerous thing for human beings, that we need to be much more involved with agriculture, much more involved with the growing of food and the growing of animals and the feeding of animals with the food that we grow. And this whole cycle, to me, is a very important part of helping us to open up our perceptions to things that we otherwise are, closed to. So that's what
it's interesting to me that sort of regular people who are more in touch with the earth, especially farmers, I think they have a sort of naive sense of this. I remember this year when I was doing something on the farm with another guy, and he's not sort of a thinker by any stretch of the imagination, but he was telling me about a friend of his who was talking about living in the city, and he said, I just thought this is a really sort of down-to-earth way of expressing something profound. He said, walking around on concrete all day just does something to your head. And isn't that something? He's just sort of encapsulated, a sort of fundamental theme that you have people writing books about. He's just sort of said it in this pithy one-liner. And I've noticed the same thing with, we were talking about lab-grown meat. I mean, it seems like the people around me, they just have a sort of gut level aversion to, when A&W comes out with the new, sort of, what do they call it? Beyond Meat burger. They just have a sort of general aversion to it. They just don't want to eat it. There just seems to be something wrong with it. So I find that interesting.
There's something wrong with it. There's something very wrong with it, But there's also, something very wrong with how we're treating, with how we're treating the animals in the industrial.
Yeah,
the abuse.
Let me speak
you
to
have
that.
to think. I don't know. I just like the abuse of cows, like cow abuse is like. It's a horrible thing. It's almost like a horrible thing like child abuse. The thought of it should just turn our stomachs and make us want to live in a different way and get our food from animals that, live in a natural environment, because, there's such a relationship between these ruminants and the grasses and the land and the nutrition of the human beings. And it's just, I mean, there's so much there. So that would be my, like, if I was to say a practical thing, other than the spirituality, other than the, being involved in liturgy, prayer, or scripture reading the old books, reading good fiction, that kind of thing. The thing that I think is important is, getting into that natural world. That's why, like, one of my early conversations I had with Paul VanderKlay, I was talking about a conversation that I had seen between John Vervaeke and Jordan Hall on the Rebel Wisdom. And they were having this really, high level conversation going up and up and up and up. And then at some point, and I told Paul VanderKlay this, I said, it was like they were going up, like they were going up in a balloon or something. And I wanted to grab the rope and I wanted to pull them down and say, guys, what are you eating and what are you feeding people? Because I want to get down to those basics, So
I must say, that Jordan Hall character just he triggers me in a weird way. I mean, all of his talk about meta language and meta human and meta this, meta that. I just want to slap him or something. Yeah, I don't want to slap him, but it just triggers me in a weird way where I think when you start talking about meta too much, you're not talking about anything at all. But I have a few things to say about what you were just saying. I mean. Have you read Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si? I mean, it strikes me that a lot of what you're getting at sort of very, very consonant with what he's communicating there.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure because I'm not. I'm just not sure where he's coming from. In other words, when it comes to the Catholic social teaching, I kind of rely more on Ratzinger and more on Pope Leo XIII and that kind of thing. And just I don't find Pope Francis's teachings to be very clear. I find them to be quite open to a wide variety of interpretations, and I think kind of too much ambiguity that can be used to go one way or another. So he's not my favorite Catholic writer by any means.
Yeah,
But
I've heard that critique from
Pope
people.
Benedict said that we needed to reimagine agriculture and that the rural farming family needed to be at the center of Catholic social teaching. So that's kind of, you know.
It struck me recently, Pope Benedict talks about a dictatorship of relativism, and it didn't strike me at first as super helpful way of describing what's going on, but then I realized what he's sort of getting at is this this sort of desiring self that's sort of behind the consumerism, where there's, he sort of puts it this way, when he sort of throughout all of the moral restraints, all that's left is sort of this desiring self that wants to eat everything. And then that's connected to what Francis talks about, the throwaway culture. And you could think about like old folks' homes, or, widespread abortion, and, the consumer lifestyle, where it's all tied up to this sort of devouring self that's, it's basically God versus mammon at the end of the day, isn't it? It's sort of the God who sort of goes to the end of himself at the cross and gives himself for humanity, versus this spirit that just wants to suck all of God's creation into himself.
Yeah, there is, the earth can provide the sustenance for human need, but it cannot bear the overreach of human greed. So
yeah,
there's enough for our need, but there's not enough for our greed. And it's, okay, I got the recording going again. Yeah, I lost you there for a minute. So I was just saying, there's definitely a lot of changes that we need to make. I don't see them being very easy to make in a structural way. But if enough of us make them individually and as families, then they, they may end up affecting the structure. But I think that in terms of what we wanted to talk about, are you done talking about that part of the book? Because we're going kind of long now.
Yeah, I have one more thing I wanted to throw in with this environmental conversation. So I wrote a piece not too long ago where I was talking about Christianity and climate change, and then I sort of started out the piece with a sort of a right-wing temptation and then a left-wing temptation with regards to creation care / climate change. And then I said, the sort of right-wing temptation is to sort of completely dismiss environmental concerns or the issue of climate change, because they sort of tie them up with, the overreach of, environmental groups, or they're sort of worried about all of that. And so there's just this tendency to completely dismiss caring for the environment, because they get too caught up in, oh, the other side does this, so I'm not going to do this. I sort of see a lot of this stuff in certain circles. And then the left-wing temptation for me is to sort of adopt a consequentialism, where you sort of say the reason we should be caring for climate change is because, let me put it the wrong way. The reason we should be caring for creation is because we're about to wipe ourselves out because of this environmental catastrophe. And I suppose the problem there is you're sort of trying to solve the problem by the very thing that caused it in the first place. You've created, you have this sort of instrumental stance where you're saying, reality is like this big machine that if we just turn the knobs this way and this way, we can sort of get our little path to human flourishing. but oops, we must have turned this knob a bit too much in this direction. So suddenly we have an environmental crisis on our hands. And so we just need to, you know, adjust the knobs. And then you have all of these technological solutions, you know, just patch up the hull of our ship and we can continue in the same direction we're going to begin with. Something like your example of, you know, against the sort of factory farming problem, you put forward this food that's produced in a lab. And this is sort of a consequentialist approach because it says, oh, well, look at the problem we've created. Suddenly we don't have enough animals to feed to feed everyone. So let's just continue down the same path, but make this technological solution that that's going to fix the problem that we've created using technology. So I guess what you sort of need is not a new technological solution, a new innovation that can sort of sustain our lifestyle that's just in violence with creation. What you need is what Pope Francis would call an ecological conversion. You need a new mode of interacting with nature. You need to have a more healthy relationship with the natural world, and this could include something like like you're talking about, getting your food from the earth that you plant and that you cultivate and that you produce and that you eat, and that so there's this sort of almost marriage with the earth that's happening, where you're in a fruitful union with the earth, versus this this stance that stands over above it and tries to tinker with the machine to get it to get towards the ends you wanted to have. And I think this is all connected to all the way back to the book when Ratzinger is talking about what is the two different stances he has. The one is stand, understand, and the other is
no make.
No make. Yeah, we have to get back to a stand, understand stance. I think. Do you sort of get what I'm getting at with this consequentialist thing?
I think I do, in the sense that what you're saying is that we've produced a lot of the problems that we produce them by technology, so we can't get out of them by just pursuing more of technology.
Yeah.
And so they require a kind of a change in outlook.
And
the problem is extremely complex, because I would say that most of the people who start talking about the environment and who start talking about energy and all of these things don't realize, they don't have a technical understanding of where things come from, where prosperity comes from, how a people becomes prosperous, all of the things that they want to have in their society, and how those things are achieved. Most people do not begin to comprehend the power that we rely on in terms of fossil fuels, and how valuable they are and what they have allowed us to accomplish, and how we ought to be husbanding them into the future. So, we think about, an engine, for example, drives our car, a few miles down the road with basically a thimble full of gasoline. And we just don't realize how much power there is in those fossil fuels. so that if we were to suddenly stop using them, we go back to using human power, and you don't realize how much human power it takes. People generally don't really conceive how much human power it would take to replace even a small engine. Maybe you can get a sense of it if you think about the difference between using a chainsaw, a gasoline-powered chainsaw versus sawing that limb off by hand.
Yeah.
Okay? So you're talking about something that could take you all day practically to try to go through a large limb or several large limbs on a tree with a handsaw versus the few minutes it's going to take you with a chainsaw. But everything is like that. Everything in our society is like that. People talk very glibly about doing away with these things with no conception of what it would take to replace them or how rapidly our standard of living would decrease without them. So what is needed, the conversation we need to have is one of saying, we have this tremendously powerful resource. What is the best use we should make of it? Where should it be replaced, and in what way should it be replaced? Because a lot of the conversation that people have about how to replace these things is really pie in the sky. It's out of touch with the technical reality of how these things work. And and a lot of the ideas about, well, we'll replace it with solar, we'll replace it with wind, doesn't take into account what goes into the manufacturing of those things and their transportation and their replacement when they fail. So the wind turbines they create have these huge, fan blades on them. Besides the fact that they kill a lot of birds, the fan blades wear out and they're not biodegradable. So now you've got tons of this stuff that's can't be recycled and isn't biodegradable. And what do you do with that? And it goes on and on and on and on. But people, we could sit down together and we could have a conversation about this, identify the problem and have a conversation about where we need to put these resources and, how to make transitions to different things if we need to, where this precious resource of these fossil fuels is best used and what it's best used for. I would venture to say that plastic Christmas toys for children is not the best use of petroleum. Just throwing that out there, right? So, that's just one idea. But, we could have a conversation about that, but we have these entrenched interests who are interested in it being a certain way and not making changes. Right?
Yeah.
And that's the problem. We can't even engage in the conversation in the way that we need to engage in the conversation, except at a very low level, like in a neighborhood or as a family or as a group of friends or maybe as a parish or congregation. So I don't know what to do about it, but I know that that's the kind of conversation we need to have, and our entire political and economic structure that we have keeps us from having that conversation.
Oh yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. But I think I'm about out of
steam.
Yeah. You outlasted me, Mary.
But it's great to talk to you, and I will go ahead and end the recording now, and then we'll
super helpful.